I see I have won the most coveted speaking spot of the conference right after a big lunch. So I'll try to keep you awake. But I really will probably do that through your questions. I'll keep my remarks relatively brief so that we can to get to that exchange, and you can share your ideas with me, and I can perhaps share a few of my ideas with you. But come on in, and thank you so much for having me back. It's exciting to see this conference grow every single year. And someone was just asking me yesterday if I'm optimistic about high-speed rail. And I actually am. I'm not optimistic about a lot of things at this very moment, but I am about high-speed rail. I actually think we're getting close to a tipping point. There's energy building, the movement is growing, and you can feel across the country that people care about this a lot more than they did before. I was actually having breakfast with a friend of mine that I met when I was 13, and someone asked, it was not a breakfast about transportation whatsoever, but someone asked a question about high-speed rail. And I said, well, look, as Jeff knows, I've been talking about this since I was 13. And he said, yep, he has. And the amazing thing is that a lot more people are talking about it in just the last 5 years. I came to Congress in 2015, and high-speed rail was a big thing for me, but I didn't talk about it much because it wasn't a very politically resonant issue at the time, and that has really changed. In part, I know that's due to your work, to getting this story out there so that people across the country, but especially young people, are really engaged in the idea of a high-speed rail future for the country. That's the biggest change, is how many young people get involved. I actually brought my social media guy here, Justin, who's dutifully filming here. And it's amazing how well our high-speed rail posts do. Like, we didn't even bother with high-speed rail posts in 2015. And now there's some of our most popular posts on social media because there is this energy and enthusiasm. But there also are some changes. I don't know if you noticed, but there is a new president in town. Have you got word of this? We actually pulled up out front, and I was looking at my notes in the car, and I got out, and I was confronted with this big sign for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and I figured it was my turn to be deported for something I had said last night or whatever. But instead, we went into a different door to come in to see you all here. The Trump administration presents some serious challenges, not just to anti-corruption efforts and basic constitutionality, but it also presents some opportunities. And I'm not talking about the Qatari plane, although $400 million for high-speed rail is something I would be enthusiastic about. No, I think that there is actually some reason to be hopeful that in this administration, we can get some energy for projects that make sense financially for the private sector. And that might sound like a narrow window, but it's an important window, because I think that the more you get the private sector engaged in our efforts, frankly, the way they are more overseas, I think it will give energy and momentum to the progress that we've made thus far. Now, we will have to accept some losses. One of the first things the administration did was cut the funding for the Texas Central project, which, as you probably know from my history, is near and dear to my heart. But it doesn't mean that that is completely dead. It means that we have to have an alternative that re-emphasizes the private sector role in that project. The financials still make sense. The cost is still the equivalent of a small pittance of what Texas spends on highways, a handful of singular highway interchanges to build an entire high-speed rail line between Dallas and Houston. The goal should be 60 minutes, not 90, but we can get there, and we can start today by making sure that the private sector is in the lead. It's actually the way this project started in its most recent iteration. It's a more contemporary development that Amtrak took it over. But the point is that we have to find and emphasize and build on these opportunities that the FRA has presented. When they canceled the grant, they explicitly came out and said, we're not against rail projects. We're not against high-speed rail projects, but we want to invest in ones that make sense. Well, there's a lot that makes sense. When the Trump administration says what makes sense, it's what makes sense politically. We can figure that out. It's going to take a little more strategizing. We may need to approach things differently than we have in the past. But if anyone is coming here and telling you that we just need to stand pat and hold tight for 4 years, that's the wrong approach. I think that we can get some serious work done. We may have to adjust our priorities. We may talk about it a little bit differently. But there's a reason that high-speed rail is so successful all across the world. And it's not that there is some vast high-speed rail conspiracy that's infected every other country except our own. It's because it actually makes sense. And I don't need to tell you, you probably know better than almost everybody else how skewed the subsidies are in America. The billions and billions, 535 billion that we've put in the interstate highway system, the 54 billion that we've used to simply bail out the airlines, the 13 or so billion that we're talking about this week for investing in air traffic control, when just a few years ago, when the analogous system was proposed for railroads, positive train control, the next generation of train control, there wasn't even a discussion about having Congress pay for it. It was just shoved down the throats of our railroads. So the level playing field is not even close to even. And that is why we don't have high-speed rail in America yet. But my point is that there is a real business argument for high-speed rail. There is a fiscally conservative argument for high-speed rail, as I said to a Republican standing in the locker room in his towel this morning, and I got a commitment for him to sit down with me and talk about high-speed rail. There is a Trump administration argument for high-speed rail, and we just got to figure out how to make it. So with that, let me turn it over to you, and I'm delighted to take this conversation wherever you would like. I may not be a high-speed rail expert, but when it comes to Congress, I'm about as the best you're going to get. So don't hold back.
Congressman?
Oh, sorry, Karen.
Oh. So thinking about how we talk about things differently. How do we keep Amtrak and high-speed rail from being just two big tar babies for this administration?
This administration believes in the private sector. And so I think we've got to move the private sector into the lead when it comes to high-speed rail. I would take these two problems separately. I wouldn't put them together. And I think, I've always said that the key to making high-speed rail succeed in America is one successful high-speed rail project. This is really important in a red state. It has to be in a red state to change the politics of high-speed rail in Washington. Now, Brightline West is sort of, kind of in a swing state, right? I'm not sure that's going to be quite enough. Texas would really put us over the line. But my point is that as we get closer to what I really believe is this tipping point, where all of a sudden you could get a lot more political support because it would be bipartisan for high-speed rail, we really do need to look to the private sector to try to get us up to that line and put us over. I hasten to emphasize to everyone who brings it up that Brightline down in Florida is not high-speed rail. And I want to disabuse everyone of that notion that it's high-speed rail. It is absolutely not high-speed rail. Brightline in Florida goes half the speed of trains in China. So don't let anyone believe it's high-speed rail, but it is a great opportunity to make the case that even slow trains can do really well if they're well run. And so I'm excited about what Brightline West is going to do. That'll probably be the first high-speed rail line that comes online. I am not afraid to criticize the mistakes that the California project has made in the past, while always emphasizing that at the end of the day, it's still cheaper to build high-speed rail than to build the alternative highway expansions and airport expansions required to meet 2050 demand. I actually wrote my Harvard Business School thesis equivalent on this issue. I wrote on what we did a financial analysis of California high-speed rail and came to two conclusions. This was back in 2011. One, it's going to cost more than people are saying it will. And two, even at that significantly inflated cost, it still costs a lot less than the alternatives. So making this fiscally conservative argument for high-speed rail, that it's so efficient, it's such a good use of taxpayer dollars, it has such an ROI that even the private sector genuinely wants to invest in it, and that a little bit of government investment to prime the pump can bring in a lot more private investment. That sounds a lot like the deals that you hear out of the Trump administration today on a whole variety of things, right? That is the argument to move high-speed rail forward. Now, I told you that I think we should keep Amtrak separate. You know, Amtrak, I think, is probably in a bit more just survival mode right now. And it's going to, again, depend on Republican members of Congress, House and Senate, to make sure that train lines aren't cut. But as much as I'm a champion of Amtrak and I lead the appropriations letter for the entire House every single year, Amtrak, as it exists today, is not the future of rail transportation in America. And so Amtrak is going to help us get through and provide service in the interim. But, you know, in my vision for the future of America, you're riding trains like that, not trains like the California Zephyr and the Southwest Chief. That's pretty old fashioned. Okay. Yes,
my question is about Texas, and that is not only the headwinds at federal level, but at the state level in Texas. How can we help persuade the governments in Texas to be supportive of high-speed rail?
By using the arguments I just laid out. As I always said when I was working on the project, high-speed rail has amazing benefits for the environment. Probably a lot better than you even think. And Texas ranchers do not care. So that is not the argument you make in Texas. And it would pain me when people would come down from out of state and try to make the environmental argument for high-speed rail in Texas, because it just doesn't resonate there. And you can have the principled argument all you want, but that's not the argument that's going to succeed in Texas. What succeeds in Texas is better use of taxpayer dollars, private sector involvement, and getting Republican members of the prominent Republicans in the private sector to encourage it, which is exactly why we got a lot of Republican investors in the project. It was mostly Republican investors. That was it's not just where the money was. It was a very conscious effort to shape the politics of the project, and that needs to continue. I would say we need to double down on it. The good news is we got a good start. Okay, sorry, who's next? Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks, Representative Moulton. I'm Peter Biazza. I work for Bechtel. One of the things I'm thinking about is how to broaden the coalition of support for high-speed rail. And so there are some other initiatives in policy that I think have broad bipartisan support, like affordable housing, attainable housing. Would love to learn kind of the work that's going on in order to kind of broaden this support for high-speed rail and make friends with the loudest voices in the room.
There's a lot of examples. Let me give you two just to answer this question. One at the sort of like low level, personal level, and one at the sort of strategic level. Okay. Starting at the ground level. All right. I am spending a lot of time just having these conversations with Republicans, like I described after my gym session this morning, to get them up to speed on what's going on. And one of my Republican counterparts on the rail subcommittee of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee came up to me a few weeks ago and said, "Seth, I just got back from Europe. You were right. Those trains are amazing. And by the way, the kind of lifestyle, like you can walk to where you need to go and you don't need a car, that's pretty nice too. But with no idea. I don't think you'd ever been to Europe before. And so that person to person education matters a lot. You know, for all of you who have relationships with business leaders and political leaders, but especially on the conservative side of things, since that's the new sheriff in town, having those conversations makes a real difference. And if you actually get a chance to show them some of this, I remember the first time I showed a picture of the inside of this Swiss train that I had just ridden to Joe Manchin as we were flying back from Europe. And we had actually taken a bus somewhere, and I said, I really wish we had taken a train. And so I showed him this picture, and he said, are you serious? Really? That's what the trains look like? But a lot of people just really don't know. So that's at the ground level. At the high level, my team is working on putting together a sort of new look at a map of high speed. I saw something on the way in. But, you know, we didn't build the interstate highway system because there was just this unbelievable demand from people in Cheyenne. And yet Cheyenne ended up being on the interstate highway system because of the way that things are get interconnected. So I get the fact that we're not talking about building high-speed rail from Los Angeles to Chicago. But the reality is that high-speed rail works between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City. It works between Salt Lake City and Denver. It works between Denver and Omaha. It works between Omaha and Chicago. And all of a sudden, when you put these individual corridors together, you find that they're contiguous and you have a national network. Now, that does a lot of things, but let me highlight two. One, it means that for people in rural areas, it does actually matter. And today, everyone thinks of high-speed rail as something that's only relevant to the East Coast or the West Coast and maybe a couple of little places in between. I don't think that's right. I think we absolutely will have a national high-speed rail network. It's just not how we think about building it. It's not how we finance it. It's not how we construct it initially. It is why it's really important to have standards of interoperability, by the way. But the point is that there is an appeal to people in the middle. And I had a very encouraging conversation about high-speed rail with a senator from a Western state recently, and I was very surprised, given how rural his state is, that he was a big supporter, a quiet supporter, but a big supporter of high-speed rail. And he recognizes exactly what I just laid out. The second thing, and I'm sure some of you have figured this out as well, is that when you have that national network, and there are a lot of people who get on the high-speed train in Chicago and go all the way to LA. There will be some, just like the people, I mean, there will be more than take that train, the Southwest Chief today on Amtrak, right? Because it'll be, I don't know, what, a third the time or something. But there won't be a lot. But there will be, if we're smart, a lot of packages. And in the same way that mail paid the bills for passenger trains in the 1950s, mail can help pay the bill for high-speed rail in the 2050s once that national network gets built out. Because 12 hours or whatever it is from Chicago to Los Angeles may not be a reasonable time. It's 15 hours for a passenger, for many passengers, but it's a heck of a reasonable time for a FedEx package, for that next Amazon delivery. It's a lot more efficient. And that will be a huge revenue source once you get this national network built. There are a lot of other reasons why the national network matters, but I highlight those two: the appeal to everybody in between, and the actual fast freight opportunity, which, by the way, almost never occurs in financial analyses of high-speed rail, and it could be really helpful.
Yeah. I'm Andrea Giuricini, professor at University Milano Bicocca in Italy and CEO of Track Consulting. Yesterday, we had a panel. I was in the panel together with GAP, Global Infrastructure Partner, BlackRock, and Plenary Group, so two big investors. And that kind of investors, they came also in Italy, for example, GAP, to buy the open access Italo NTV, that was the CEO also yesterday. In the discussion that we had in the panel, I think it was very, very interesting because they are ready to invest as a private in the railway. In Italy, they did it. What they did it, for example, in Italy, it was not investing in the infrastructure, but in the train set. Mm-hmm. So you touch the point about Amtrak. Amtrak, we know that right now there's a big question mark about the future of Amtrak, but the Northeast corridor is very attractive. If private could enter and have some capacity to use the network, and they can invest in their rolling stock, there's possibility to use a 250 kilometers per hour train. Of course, we know the problem in the line and so on, but the private will invest on that. So there's a huge opportunity also in that chapter, I think, what we call in Europe liberalization, but in reality where private enter in managing a railway company and they make a good job. So I think also this point of Amtrak would be what you told that is very, very important in terms of political to go in the direction of this administration.
Look, I think that's right. And by the way, I am supportive of open access on the Northeast corridor. You got to be careful about how you structure it and understand how the bidding is going to work and all that stuff. But yes, I think it would be good for Amtrak to have some competition. You know, I walked into Moynihan Train Hall yesterday, and I came up to a guy sitting behind a desk, and I said, "Do you know what track 2159 is on?" And he looked at me like I was an idiot, and he said, "This is the Long Island Railroad, not Amtrak." He had a screen in front of him that he could have told me. That's just one example. We've all had it, right? Amtrak could do a lot better. And by the way, yeah, Amtrak should figure out how to make that, jackass at the Long Island Railroad just answer the damn question if he's going to work in Moynihan Train Hall, right? So competition is good. I'm all for competition. And again, as much as I, have supported Amtrak over the years, I do not agree with Amtrak's vision for the country. Amtrak Joe Biden gave Amtrak a whole huge appropriations, and they designed a network of 19th century trains, 19th century speeds with mid 20th century trains is what I should say. That is not the future. That is not how I would much rather have seen Amtrak say, you give us $54 billion, we'll do Texas and, one other thing, that's what we're going to do. That will then set off investment for the future. But Amtrak needs a lot of work, and competition would help.
Congressman, your staff are telling me you have to go, unfortunately.
All right, let me say one more thing that kind of ties this all together. All right, look, the busiest high-speed rail line in the world right now is Beijing to Shanghai. All right, it was built 10 years ago. This can happen fast. And what's amazing to me about Beijing to Shanghai is it's not the distance between Washington and New York. It's actually closer to the distance between Chicago and Atlanta. And we don't talk about high-speed rail enough in these terms, about what it can mean for everybody in between, especially in these polarizing times. Beijing to Shanghai has reduced regional inequality by 25% since that line was built. And that's just getting started because it's so new. We all know that O'Hare is congested. We all know that Hartfield, Jackson, and Atlanta is congested. We could pour billions of dollars into those airports as we've done many times in the past. And those investments would be good for the economies of Chicago and Atlanta. But it wouldn't do anything for Louisville. Wouldn't do anything for Nashville. Wouldn't do anything from Indianapolis. How many people have been to Indianapolis lately? There's not much going on in Indianapolis. But imagine how much that would change if you had trains every 30 or 45 minutes between Chicago and Atlanta. It made it possible to live in Indianapolis and work in Chicago, be home for dinner. It brought people, students, young people, old people, connected in all of these in-between places. America needs something to bring us together. And high-speed rail can actually be part of that solution. That's the story that we've got to continue to tell. And that's the story that will resonate at a time when there are a lot of red state leaders in those places in between who are in charge down the street. So let's get out and do that work. Thank you very much for having me.